People in our own backyards are hurting. There are insecurities around food, economics, mental health, access to justice, healthcare, and our society continues to become more divisive. But there is hope. Right here in Chicagoland, there are people and organizations who are on the front lines, working to bring about positive and transformative change. Each week, we're going to meet some of these agents of change and examine how they are spurring innovative ideas and finding solutions to push our society forward in a more just direction. I'm Sufyan Sohel, and this is Change Agents. On July 18th, 29-year-old Sania Khan was murdered by her ex-husband. She was a photographer and had become a voice for women who are fighting marriage trauma and stigma within the South Asian community. Her ex-husband drove 700 miles to her home to kill her, and then he killed himself. According to the Violence Policy Center, about a dozen murder-suicides take place in the United States every week, about 2/3 of which involve intimate partners. Domestic violence experts say women are most at risk of being killed by an intimate partner when they're leaving the relationship. In their lifetime, approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have experienced severe physical violence by an intimate partner. 1 in 10 women and 1 in 43 men have experienced stalking. 1 in 6 women and 1 in 14 men have experienced contact sexual violence. 41% of Black women, 37.3% of white women, 34.4% of Latina women, and 18.3% of Asian and Pacific Islander women have reported contact sexual violence, physical violence, and/or stalking in their lifetime. To talk more about Sania Khan and the stigmas and taboos around domestic violence in our communities, I am pleased to welcome Noor Raheemullah Hasan, the Executive Director of the Muslim Women's Alliance. Noor, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Noor, can you tell us more about Sania Khan, who she was and what happened?
I think Sania was a vibrant young woman, and her story started even before her story about, her issues that were happening in her marriage. She actually had been posting, and I guess if you could say it, like a lot of people were following her because of her story of South Asian stigma that goes on with marriages, and then ended up being in divorces as well. So I think this was something that she gained a big platform, and upon that was a wedding photographer. So a lot of women had been meeting this young lady, not knowing that the same lady that they've been following on these social media platforms is the woman that's been photographing their weddings.
Oh, wow. So talk a little bit about those stigmas. You have this lady who left an unhealthy marriage and came to Chicago, was living in Chicago, and was now taking pictures of other people's weddings and marriages and bringing joy into their lives. But while sharing her own story of, and what sort of stories was she sharing on social media?
I think she was discussing a lot about some of the stigmas of being a South Asian Muslim woman who, divorce is frowned upon. Divorce is not something you're supposed to do at the last resort. And even when the last resort comes, I think a lot of women feel scared or they feel like shunned by their own family members. Even if there's violence included in it, there'll be, families that will say, have some more patience or have, let it go, or you need to work on it. I mean, how do you tell a woman that is being, abused to keep working on it? Like, what is she doing wrong in the situation? Sania, from what I understand as well, would be discussing her journey into that, discussing some of the stuff like, what are people going to think? And so things that she's been hearing about, like, what is our community going to say if you come back as a divorced woman? There is no such thing Islamically that shuns divorced women. It's actually a right upon any Muslim woman to be able to divorce. And so some of these cultural nuances are there and are kind of creating extra baggage for women to be able to live their lives, honestly. So in her situation, and unfortunately, she was almost, it was so traumatizing for a lot of women to see this story because she was almost there. She was almost out. She had been speaking it was kind of turning up. She was leaving, actually, Chicago. She was going to be moving back with her family in Tennessee. And so even the weekend before she got murdered, so many people had seen her at different weddings, and the last things that she had been talking about was just that, I'm going to be getting out. I'm going to be getting out. And then Monday this happened.
That's so unfortunate and devastating. What was the community response to her murder?
So I think women were very shocked, So I had met her. She was my niece's wedding photographer, and I thought she was you don't usually talk to the photographer, but in her instance, she was this really great personality. And so me, my dad, everybody, we had met her. So this is how, she kind of projected herself as more than just like a regular wedding photographer. Women who had heard her story, who had been following her, were shocked, devastated. They just couldn't believe it. It was all over, so many people's social media feeds that they can't believe that they just met this lady, that she just photographed their happiest moments and this happened. I think there was definitely women who've gone through, who saw her story as hope and then felt really like shocked, like it was almost like a slap in the face, like, oh my gosh, she was almost there, and then this happened. As far as that's how the women responded. But to be honest with you, I was a little dismayed by how some of the community leaders actually were silent.
Mostly men?
I mean, mostly men, yeah, and mostly men. And it's always seems to be this case that like, okay, what can we, asking the question instead of, you're very intelligent enough to realize that you put out statements, you put out social media posts, you put out statements for other events that are happening. But when these kind of situations happening, it's like crickets. We don't hear anything, we don't hear support. And this kind of in turn goes back to what our Muslim women see and see that like, okay, we don't feel like our community is with us, because we don't hear anything. You're not supporting this. You're not saying anything. You're not coming out and speaking out against this. It's just women speaking for women as usual.
Thank you for sharing that. And a lot of what I'm hearing from you, I hear a lot from people of other vulnerable and marginalized communities of these patriarchal systems that are in place where women and the role women play are minimized. Do you see a lot in the communities you identify with of that? And could that contribute to this feeling that women have that they have to take the brunt of this abuse and violence that they may see or even hear about from others in the community?
I think there is definitely, because of the stigmas that are out there, there's this fear of talking about it or even conversing about these issues in your marriage with other people outside of even your family. Like there's no support network, there's no sort of group, therapy type of thing happening. I think there's also this level of obviously, and I think we had been speaking about this earlier, but there was a couple statistics that came out in regards to Illinois Muslims. And I was shocked to see that, it's not, it's just that the level of what Illinois residents and what Illinois Muslims, the reporting of domestic violence incidents, there was like a 30%, not reporting. So about, 30% discrepancy between what regular Illinoisans are reporting and what Illinois Muslims are. So they are not reporting domestic violence incidents. They are not reporting these issues to their leaders of faith as well. So, if there's no sort of accountability, you're not going to the law enforcement. You're not going to your leadership, your faith leaders. So where do you go? Where do you go with this information? You're kind of just like holding it in.
And it kind of went to the statistics I shared earlier too, where Asian Pacific Islanders were the least percentage of reported cases of abuse. And I want to emphasize reported because I feel domestic violence victims are always, no matter their faith, background, even gender, there's so many issues about or reasons they may not report it. But I feel it's heightened with specific communities, including the South Asian and Muslim communities. Can you go into some of the factors or reasons why they may be underreported?
From what my understanding is, I think, and this is part of what we do too, is like raising awareness on these so-called taboo topics. I think that the underreporting is also based on, and what we've seen in this unfortunate trend of some of these murder-suicides that have been happening in the community is frustration of nothing's actually happening, nothing's changing, nothing's getting done. So I speak my voice. Look at Sonia, she spoke her voice and look at how it ended. So I think there's definitely a lot of women who felt triggered actually by Sonia's case because of the fact that, I knew people who, might have been actually out of their relationship, but still feeling triggered by what just happened, and fear of their lives, even after they've been outside of their violent relationship. So I definitely think it's like the lack of support, lack of action from the community that just kind of is like, well, who's listening? Who's listening anyway?
Do you think there's more fear amongst women that this happened to her, this may happen to me?
I think there's a fear. There's definitely a fear. There's also the level of financial support that might not be out there. So I feel like a lot of women will stay because of the fact that there's legal issues that happen that like you don't know how to kind of do this in an appropriate way. No mother wants to leave their children behind. No mother wants to leave their children behind. And if this means that I got to stay with my, abuser to enforce that I stay with my child, that's a big issue too. That's a big issue in immigrant cultures as well, because not understanding your legal rights, not understanding your Islamic rights, kind of gives you this, you're kind of like, it kind of opens yourself up to a lot of these issues too.
Thank you. You guys are doing such wonderful work at the Muslim Women's Alliance. My last question for you today is, you're the mother of 4 beautiful children, 2 of which are young men. What would you want them to know about their role in combating gender violence?
I think that, and this comes up even as teenage boys, just the way you are actually, how you view women. It really starts from a very young age. Obviously, me being the organization of Muslim Women's Alliance, I've had this conversation with my boys often. I think it's not a wait till it happens kind of situation. I think these are conversations you need to be having with your sons, your brothers, your husbands at all times. When these kind of situations happens, I want them to understand what the issues are. I want them to understand what are the kind of the stigmas. And so that they also understand now they have, and also with my 2 sons are my 2 daughters. So they realize that there's a lot of discrimination out there for females and for your sisters. And this is something that you need to have a voice when you come from a place of privilege, male privilege, that you use your voice in an appropriate manner, that you speak out for those who cannot speak for themselves. And I think this is in general even in this situation too. Make sure you're using your voice. Don't just use it for social media likes, but actually use it to impact and help those that need it.
Noor, thank you so much for that reminder that we all have a responsibility to use our voice in advocacy for others, and especially for this issue. I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with Neha Gill, the Executive Director of Apna Ghar.
I'm Darius Hillman, inviting you to tune into the next In the Arena, when I'll be joined by educator, philanthropist, activist, children advocate, grandmother, mentor, friend, my former boss, and Chicago's mother, the indomitable Peggy A. Montez. Honest, thoughtful, and compelling conversations with a decidedly Chicago flavor. In the Arena, Friday nights at 7 p.m. on CanTV 19 and streaming on cantv.org.
Welcome back. To dive deeper into the topic of domestic violence, I now am pleased to have Neha Gill, Executive Director of Apna Ghar, with me today. Neha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure, Neha. Recently, I've seen a lot in the media about domestic violence happening, a lot to the South Asian community. Some are more murder-suicides, excuse me. Is this a new phenomena, or is this the norm?
Unfortunately, it is the norm. Domestic violence can be very violent, and it ultimately culminate in this type of thing, a murder-suicide. I think recently, because of social media, and in particular Sonia Khan's case, I think we are hearing a lot more about it. Unfortunately, it's also one of those things that doesn't really get reported as domestic violence. And so even though it is something that happens frequently, in a way where, although it was very, very tragic what happened to Sonia and what happens to other survivors, I'm glad that we actually have an opportunity to speak about it because she was so public on social media.
She was, and it was so unfortunate what happened. But isn't there a fear that by sharing more of these stories, we may empower others to become perpetrators in domestic violence?
I really hope not. The way I look at it is that I think it empowers survivors. I think she was a strong voice for survivors. I think she was really able to articulate what was happening with her, and also sort of like whether she was receiving support from the community or her family and whether she wasn't. And so I really think that from what I've seen also, that it was actually empowering to survivors, and I hope that that is what happens from it.
So let's talk a little bit about Apna Ghar. You've been there almost 20 years. You may have seen thousands, if not tens of thousands of cases come in. What are some trends that you see in terms of victims and perpetrators?
So I think as an organization, we really do see the most egregious forms of domestic violence. I think people, come to us. We really think of ourselves as community-based. We're rooted in the South Asian community. We have cultural competency to serve the South Asian community. But it really, to reach out to an organization, someone's got to be either experiencing really, really bad forms of domestic violence, or they lack a social network. So, unfortunately, we kind of see the worst of the worst. But the flip side of it is that we also see very resilient survivors. We see people really, making it against all odds and really fighting for survival. And so that, I think, is the thing that kind of keeps me going. I think that's the thing that keeps the organization going, because we really feel the strength of the survivors. We really see the ways in which they have so courageously survived what they're experiencing, but are also then looking for safety for themselves and for their children in particular, and really looking to make a better life for themselves. But they're also really doing amazing things in terms of supporting other survivors. So they're really like our best advocates as well. So if someone receives services from us, they go back into the community and tell people about us. And that's actually how more survivors find out about us and more people seek our services.
Well, that's really great. You kind of hit one of my future questions of your inspiration, and I appreciate you sharing that. But after almost 20 years and almost 10 years in your current role, what keeps you, you're dealing with heavy, heavy things on a daily basis. You're seeing the worst of humanity. You do talk about the hope and the resiliency, but you're also seeing just darkness all the time. What keeps you energized to keep waking up every day and do this work?
I think, also like trying to make a dent in that darkness. So from the survivors, we certainly see the resilience, the courage, kind of the best of what can happen from a terrible situation. But on the other side, I think we're motivated to make the change so that this doesn't keep happening to survivors. So we are really thinking about, it is in our mission statement to end gender violence. And so we really are thinking about, what does it take? And I think what it takes is really finding ways to address the people who are causing the harm, who are causing survivors to have to leave and to seek safety and to start over. And leaving doesn't just mean leaving an abusive relationship. Leaving means sometimes leaving family, leaving community, leaving everything you've known to start over, literally. So, the burden on survivors is huge. And so what we really want to think about is, how do the people who are causing harm change as individuals, but how does the culture, or how does patriarchy and all of the things that sort of fuel this violence, how do we make a dent in that?
I have so many follow-up questions for you. First is, why don't victims just pick up and walk away?
So one thing that's not understood, so one, I think like the thing that sort of bothers me about that line of questioning is that why do the people who are causing the harm cause the harm and create that situation in the first place, right? Secondly, practically speaking, survivors know what's happening in their situation the best, and often leaving is when it's most dangerous for them.
Can you go into that a little bit,
Yeah,
please?
so I think that the central dynamic in domestic violence is power and control.
Sure.
And that's actually the time when someone's, made the decision to leave. They've decided that they don't want to be in this situation anymore. That's usually the time the person that's causing the harm feels the most, like sort of a sense of loss of their power and control. And that's actually when the homicides occur the most, right? So it's either after someone's left, or, for example, in Sania's case, like the divorce is either being finalized or close to being finalized. So there's a finality to that, and the person that's causing the harm is really feeling the end and that loss of their power over this person. And so, the ways in which we work around that is to kind of let the survivors define their situation. We don't really tell them to leave, not leave. We don't, prescribe a way to deal with their situation. What we try to do is individualize it and try to let them lead, so that we know that they know their situation the best. And so we work with what they're telling us in terms of the safety planning, in terms of whatever is next. And so I think sometimes there's a perception that if you call an organization like Apna Ghar, they're going to tell you to leave. But we have a 24-hour crisis line. We can talk as many times as someone needs. We can work with whatever it is that they're working with, knowing that they understand their situation the best.
And how much do you charge for these services?
Our services are free.
Okay, so are you seeing, I know we were talking earlier and you talked about how pandemic resulted in potentially a larger amount of domestic violence issues. Have you seen more of an uptick of individuals and calling Apna Ghar for resources
So I
and
think
support?
earlier on there was actually a drop in the calls.
Okay.
And I think that's because people were in the home or in the same, like kind of vicinity of the people that were causing them harm. So they were sort of trapped with the person that might be hurting them. And so it was difficult to make those calls for help. But, we kind of created different options like texting, emails, chat, kind of using technology. And so the texts actually increased once people realized that, a text was a way to reach us. And so we, dealt with that situation. I think that people are sort of calling. One of the things that happens frequently at Apna Ghar is that people just walk in, because sometimes you just find the right time to be, get out of the situation and just go talk to someone. And that's the only opportunity you have. And so some of those things were compromised in the beginning of the pandemic in terms of the services. But what we did see in terms of people's experience is that the frequency and the severity of the violence absolutely increased. So, because survivors didn't have coping strategies, they couldn't leave the house to go to work, they couldn't take the kids to school or after school activities, because the ways in which survivors are coping is to try to avoid that violence, and then they really couldn't. And so that's something we definitely saw during the pandemic.
Wow. I know once I received a phone call from a lady who had to wait for her husband to leave for work, and she would go walk to the nearby bank to call our office for support because she was not able to use the phone at her house and was afraid of what that reaction or response would be. So do you see a lot of that, especially with elderly or those who may have limited English proficiency?
Yeah, absolutely. We recently had a case where the survivor just locked herself in the bathroom and called us, and we could hear her husband actually try to break the door down. And so we had to, work quickly to support her, but we called the police. Then we had to sort of help the police navigate the situation because, she didn't speak English. She, come to the U.S. very recently. So, we had to kind of help navigate all of those things. And we had to ensure that, the police knew that they could escort her to us. And that she knew that, we could help her go back to get the children and all of those things. And so we're lucky in a way that she knew to call us. And she had heard about us at her mosque. And so she'd sort of kept the number. And so one of the things we do is a lot of community outreach to make sure that people know that we're around 24/7.
This is just great work that you're doing. You talked a little bit about some of the problems that our communities have. I've been reading about patriarchal systems, and I've experienced those. I may have exhibited some of those misogynistic tendencies. The role of the woman, the wife. I talked about language barriers, financial limitations. So what's it going to take? You talked about how we need to change what these conversations are about. We need to change what this norm is. We need to change these stereotypes and stigmas. What's it going to take?
I think it's going to take us looking at each other as equals, right? I think there's a lot of conversation in workspaces about equity, but I think the root of gender-based violence is seeing women or people of a different gender as less than.
Sure.
And so I really think that we need to, and a lot of cultural norms are based in that. It's this idea that women are less than men. Men are more privileged, and so those are. I think that's fundamentally that's what it's going to take. But of course, there are building blocks to that, right? It's easy to say that. It's easy to even think that that's what we're doing. But because we've been socialized to not necessarily think that way. There's a lot of unlearning. There's a lot of ways in which we have to be very, very cognizant of those tendencies and also be aware of what we need to do to change that. And I would also say that, what we need to do to hold people in our networks accountable to that. How do we talk to how does a brother talk to his brother about these things? And how do we then also hold the brother accountable if that brother isn't necessarily treating women in his life very well?
No, thank you. A lot of food of thought for me and so many other men out there who do want to be allies and support, but sometimes just may not know what steps should be done so that we're on the right side of these conversations. So I appreciate it. My last question is, you shared with me the video of Nishat, who grew up in a house full of abuse, and they reached out to Apna Ghar for support, her and her mother. What is she doing now, and where's she up to?
Nishat is wonderful. I mean, she was wonderful when she came to us. And again, she and her mother both really just, their resilience and their sort of drive to have a different life, even though when they came here, they didn't know anybody else. And it was their neighbor who told them about Apna Ghar. And they literally just started over with us. But Nishat graduated from Georgetown University. She's got a job with the federal government. While she was at Georgetown, she started a domestic violence group. She comes back to volunteer at Apna Ghar every year. And she's in a wonderful, healthy relationship. So she has really learned to sort of renegotiate everything. Her mom's doing well. And we're really fortunate that, Nishat and a lot of the other survivors we've served stay in communication with us, because one of the things we try to do at Apna Ghar is also create community, because, as I spoke about earlier, they're really leaving everything behind.
Yeah.
And so it's wonderful for them to meet other survivors, to be in community with us. It's wonderful for us. And so that's just, something that we really strive to do.
Neha, thank you so much for joining us and sharing so much about the wonderful work of Apna Ghar. Be sure to check out Apna Ghar and Muslim Women's Alliance's websites, see ways that you can volunteer and support them. We'll be right back with this week's Change in Action. In this week's Change in Action, I have the honor of introducing you to Kinza Khan, a Chicagoland attorney who volunteers at Heart, a nonprofit dedicated to healing, education, advocacy, research, and training around the topics of sexual health, sexual assault, and domestic violence. Kinza facilitates trainings and workshops for Heart and provides the organization with legal support and perspective. She believes that education is empowerment, and with more education, we can prevent violence and abuse faced by some of our most vulnerable. She's inspired by and renews her energy for this work by seeing and working with more and more college-aged men who are eager to unlearn their own misogynistic qualities and learn how to be better and support the women in their lives and around them. Kinza shared with me that she wishes more people knew that domestic violence and community violence are related. We, collectively, need to invest in more preventative resources and efforts. Thank you so much, Kinza, for your work. Today's conversations really energized me about working with these incredible change agents. We have to combat the stigmas, gender and cultural norms, and better support efforts to combat gender violence that we see around us. We each have a role to play when it comes to bringing positive change into the lives of those most effective, and I ask that we each leave tonight asking ourselves, what more can we do to be better allies, to unlearn societal or cultural stereotypes on these issues, and to build a world where no one has to be afraid of violence based on how they identify. Let us all be change agents. Thank you again to my incredible guests for all their work, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.